I'd like to welcome you to Narrating the Holodomor, the social and cultural history of collectivization and famine in Soviet Ukraine, organized by the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, HREC, and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. And we'd like to thank the Institute for their support in organizing this conference. My name is Sofia Isayev. I'm with HREC at the University of Alberta as a research associate and assistant to HREC's Director of Education. And I'm your chair for this session, which is panel 7, entitled Narrating Memory of the Holodomor. For this session, we have 4 presenters and 2 discussants. So it's a little bit different. It was changed and combined with the session following this one. So this session will be a little bit longer, approximately 2 hours and 5 or so minutes. The second discussant will only speak to the final presentation, the 4th presentation today. This is the last session for today, therefore. So the presenters each have 20 minutes. I will ding my bell when you have 1 minute left and then ask you to wrap up after that. And discussants will have 10 minutes each, and then the time for questions will start, beginning with presenters responding to the discussants first. Please put any questions that you may have for the presenters in the chat. Like the previous sessions, we're receiving questions in the chat only. Right. So let's get started. I'll present the first speaker. Dr. Sonia Mycak is based at the Australian National University in the Centre for European Studies, where she is the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia Research Fellow. For 11 years, she held research fellowships at the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales, in the main awarded by the Australian Research Council. Her expertise lies in literary and cultural studies, with a focus on migrant and multicultural heritage in Australia and Canada. And her talk is entitled Institutionalisation of Holodomor Knowledge and Memory in Australia. Dr. Mycak, the floor is yours.
In Soviet Ukraine, Holodomor was for the most part a traumatic memory which was suppressed. Soviet authorities denied it. Survivors were afraid to acknowledge it. Meanwhile, in the diaspora, Holodomor was a traumatic memory which was expressed. This expression was counter-hegemonic and functioned as a critical and subversive engagement with Ukraine's past. In today's post-Soviet and independent Ukraine, acknowledging Holodomor is part of a process of decommunization and is acting as a counter-narrative to previous official discourse, which at first denied that any famine had occurred and then laid blame upon the victims or natural causes. Today in Ukraine, we see an institutionalization of knowledge and memory of Holodomor. This is a necessary stage in reclaiming history and solidifying Holodomor as an occurrence within Ukraine's past. The institutionalization of Holodomor knowledge and memory began within and across the diaspora, at first in United Nations displaced persons camps, then in Ukrainian communities around the world. Australia's Ukrainian community also marks the death by hunger of millions of men, women, and children as an act of genocide perpetrated by the Soviet regime against the Ukrainian people. In this presentation, I will illustrate Holodomor remembrance in Australia, a part of the diaspora where some 21,000 Ukrainian refugees immigrated immediately after the Second World War. In Australia, commemoration of Holodomor has taken several forms, each of which I will illustrate and briefly describe. Tracing these forms of institutionalization will go towards understanding the representation of Holodomor as it was embodied outside of Soviet Ukraine. Public demonstrations began early in the life of the community. Here you see a photograph of the first large public demonstration held in the streets of Sydney in 1953 to mark the 20th anniversary of Holodomor. A more recent example can be seen in the demonstration held in Canberra, the capital city, a few years ago. More recently, demonstrations have taken a technological turn. In 2019, flash mob, for example, was held in Sydney, and you see there the reference to the local dynamics, the fire restrictions which Sydney was under at the time. Commemorative events held within the Ukrainian community. Here is the program for the 70th anniversary event. And this program shows a panacheda, a burial service, poetry recitation, a choir performance, and a commemorative ribbon was distributed amongst those who were there. 10 years later, the 80th year anniversary event was held, and here you see the announcement. Now, the two events I've shown here were held in Sydney. However, such events are held around Australia. Also held around Australia are panachede, memorial prayer services conducted by Ukrainian Catholic and Orthodox parishes. Last year, the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Melbourne, and last year in Sydney. You see there an Orthodox and a Catholic priest performing a panacheda together. Last year also, a commemoration was held in Sydney's Centennial Park, a major park, where in 2013, a tree donated by the Ukrainian Women's Association had been planted to mark the 80th anniversary. A prayer service was held, attended by the Ukrainian ambassador, community members, and several Holodomor witnesses. There are also commemorative rituals performed on a communal and personal level. The commemorative ritual, the lighting of a candle within another community event. So here, for example, you see two survivors lighting a candle in memory of Holodomor victims, but the event itself is not dedicated to Holodomor. Rituals on a personal level within one's home. The Ukrainian campaign, in which the public is asked to light a candle and sometimes place it in their window in memory of victims, has gained some traction in Australia. Here you see a notice that was distributed in 2019. And this year also, the request to light a candle tonight was circulated. Publications. Leaflets were produced by the Ukrainian community for distribution. That's one side of one leaflet. The second side. Another example in English, the first side, the second side. Also, two books compiled by the Australian activist Petro Kardash. He describes himself that way. This is a compilation of historical material, including eyewitness and first-person accounts and the reproduction of photographs. Now, the book Genocide in Ukraine is described in the foreword as being a compilation of materials spanning 3 centuries. And the Holodomor features significantly amongst, quote, the various crimes committed against the Ukrainian nation during the 20th century. And as you see there, one volume is in English and one is in Ukrainian. There was also an autobiographical novel produced, Alexander Lysenko, Cursed Years, Memoirs of a Witness, was published in Ukraine in 1993. I interviewed him not long after this was published. I don't have time, unfortunately, to read what he said, but basically a tragic tale. His mother and 4 of his siblings perished, and he needed to tell this story to counteract the secrecy that the Soviet government had been engaging in. Memoirs and life writing, shorter forms. Here are some examples: Ivan Brenza, Olga Ilkiv, Mikhailo Popilnyuk, Ojena Povolenko. There were also a number of short stories based on the Holodomor experience of the Holodomor, produced Tichin Clarinets. Now, this author only wrote a few stories, and he only wrote on one point of history that he himself lived through, and that was the Holodomor. In his own words, he wrote, quote, about that horrible 1933 year, the Ukrainian famine Holodomor. Now, this short story was, in his words, based on truth about the hunger in 1933. And it actually went on to be published in 1996 in Ukraine by a newspaper produced in the region in which he had been born. Claudia Feutz also wrote a short story based on the Holodomor, and it was translated into English. Authors wrote poetry. Vasil Onufrienko wrote three. He's arguably the most prominent writer, and he wrote three poems based on his experience of the Holodomor. Grigory Vishnevy, Yevhen Zoza, and Nadia Yerema actually wrote a poem dedicated to the author of that autobiographical novel. And Helen Boris is the only author, Olena Boris, to have written in English. And if there's time, I'd like to actually finish my presentation with one of her poems. There was also a play written by Christina Savenka Bailey and performed in Sydney in 2008. It was titled Memories of the Great Holodomor in Ukraine, 1932-33. On a personal note, my daughter was asked to play a role in this. She was 5 years old, but I decided that that would actually be too traumatic for her to do. Most recently, there's been a publication in children's literature, a recent publication by Lesya Morgan Menychuk titled Baba's Chooks. Now, I've not seen this book yet, but the publisher's description reads, quote, "A wonderful tale is taken from an original memory of a historic event in Ukraine. During 1932 to 33, it tells of a family crisis, sadness, love, friendship, and hope through the eyes of 4 brown hens and their Ukrainian owner, Baba Helen. A child's history story like no other." Now, Ukrainian community newspapers. The front pages of the newspapers in November looked very different before and after independence. Here you see an early front page, and then what the front pages looked like after independence, when Ukraine was actually officially acknowledging Holodomor. The Holodomor featured in Ukrainian newspapers in several ways. In historical accounts, an early account, at first they were in Ukrainian, and in later articles started appearing also in English. Autobiographical accounts and memoirs. Poetry. On the left you see an early version, more recent versions on the right. And on far right, you actually see a poem and a sketch, and even a poem put to music. Announcements, of course, of the community commemorations, more recently again in English as well as in Ukrainian, and then, of course, reports on the commemorations as they were held. So on the left, you see a report of commemoration held in Sydney, on the right in Perth, another city in Australia. And also our community was kept abreast of scholarly work conducted overseas. So for example, in the earlier on, you see on the left an article about the work going on in Harvard. And on the right there, a announcement of a work that was a scholarly work that was published in France on Holodomor. More recently, meaning over the last decade or two, we've been kept abreast with what's actually happening in your part of the world. With most recently, there, Yaris Balan's presentation, Holodomor lecture, was covered in the newspaper here. Now, I will briefly mention one newspaper outside the community. In 2007, the Canberra Times published an article based on interviewing survivors of the Holodomor in that city. Now, unfortunately, such mainstream visibility is not a regular occurrence. And in fact, I only know of this one occurrence. Moving on to monuments. There is a monument in the city of Melbourne. It's outside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Essendon. And I'll just zoom in on the inscription. However, the national monument is in Canberra, Canberra is the capital city of Australia. So this is what we see as the national monument. It was erected in 1985. And it was a Ukrainian community endeavour. There was a committee. Funds were donated by organisations and individuals. And it became, of course, a focus for the education of the younger generation. Here we see a group of young Plastelmen, people involved in Plast, who made a visit to the monument. And this is the monument as it looks today. Now, it has become the site for, oh, sorry, I'll just give you a little bit of a zoom. Now, it's become the site for personal commemoration. This is a photograph of my mother. She's a survivor, paying respects, and her own personal commemoration. It's become the site for official commemoration. President Poroshenko and his wife laid a wreath when they visited Australia. Community commemorations occur there each year in November, and it's occasionally the site for demonstrations, public demonstrations. Now, at that same community demonstration, which I just showed you, alongside the Holodomor Memorial in Canberra, there was at that time an exhibition of historical material and photographs held. However, more significantly, there was a portrait exhibition held a few years ago, organised by the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations. That's the sort of umbrella organisation in Australia. It was launched in 2018 to commemorate 85 years since the Holodomor, with a focus on Australian Ukrainian survivors. 26 large black and white photographic portraits of living Australian Ukrainian Holodomor survivors were displayed alongside their stories. Now, it opened in Melbourne for 10 days and then later travelled to other places in Australia. A year later, in 2019, the photographs were exhibited in the Holodomor Museum in Kyiv under the title Voices Across Australia. Later, the exhibition travelled to the Dmytro Yavornitsky National Historical Museum of Ukraine. Now, oral histories, both personal and family, have played an integral role. And noting, of course, that the first-person experience was available in the diaspora at a time when it was being suppressed in Ukraine. A project was undertaken by a historian, Elizabeth Waters, at the Australian National University to collect oral histories from Holodomor survivors. What I'm showing you is a letter that she sent to us here in Sydney, to the Ukrainian Association in Sydney. Now, this project resulted in an archive now housed in the National Library of Australia, comprising 27 recorded interviews with survivors living in Canberra, Sydney, Newcastle, and Melbourne. An additional 22 interviews with survivors living in Adelaide and Perth were donated by a Mr. T. Subamyak of Adelaide, presumably a community member. And they're also included in this archive. Now, some of this material was drawn upon by Lesia Melnichuk-Morgan for her doctoral thesis of 2010, titled Remember the Peasantry, a study of genocide, famine, and the Stalinist Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine, 1932-33, as it was remembered by post-war immigrants in Western Australia who experienced it. Now, Morgan interviewed more than 40 survivors now living in Perth. Perth is in Western Australia. She went on to publish two books, Silent Memories, Traumatic Lives, Ukrainian Migrant Refugees in Western Australia, and Holodomor, Silenced Voices of the Starved Children, with Phil Webster in 2019. Now, this is based on interviews with, quote, young survivors, so young obviously at the time, young survivors of the Holodomor who eventually made their way to Western Australia. So clearly, as the titles of her work suggest, Melnichuk's work focuses on survivors living in a part of Australia, in Western Australia. Now, most recently in 2018, the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations, that umbrella organisation, began a register of all of the major survivors. Now, I'm not sure actually how that register is shaping up. In my family, this is a photograph of my grandmother. She spoke of her memories only after arriving in Australia. So evidence of that suppression, expression dynamic. She told of village collaborators in the confiscation of food, eating grass, swollen legs, the death of her children, her own near-death experience. My family and I travelled to Ukraine and attended the 85th anniversary commemoration in Kyiv a few years back. And my daughter, Polina, who was named after my grandmother, paid her respects. And it was important for her, as well as my wider family, for her to do so. So in summary, in Australia, commemoration of Holodomor has taken the following forms: public demonstrations, commemorative events held within the Ukrainian community, commemorative rituals on a communal and personal level, publications, factual material, an autobiographical novel, memoirs and life writing, short stories, poetry, a play, children's literature, features in Ukrainian newspapers, monuments, exhibitions, and oral, personal and family histories. And to conclude, and I think I can just do it before that bell has to go, to conclude, I'd like to read a poem written by a witness, Olena Boris. And you saw the cover of this book. She's the only author to have actually written in English rather than have written in Ukrainian and perhaps been translated into English. So I'd like to finish by reading her poem titled The Requiem. No, I am not Cassandra. I was not given the powers to foresee the future disasters. But the merciful God let me be born into horrors, witness the horrors, survive and remember. Should I tell my tale? Would you follow me into my memories? When you see the truth, will you believe it? Then follow me into the back streets of life, away from the hurrying crowd, seduced by the brightly lit shop windows. Come with me, lest we too get tempted and mingle with the crowd. Come with me, and don't be afraid when you see the dead, the murdered, the executed, the tortured, the starved to death. Let me kneel beside them. Let me wash blood and dirt off them with my tears. Mourn with me. They were my loved ones. Don't turn away your head in horror. Face the truth. Known and unknown, unburied, unmourned, millions crushed under the altar built to the glory of a false, cruel God.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go right into our next presenter. Dr. Wiktoria Kudela-Świątek is assistant professor at the Institute of History and Archival Studies at the Pedagogical University of Cracow, Poland, and is the author of Eternal Memory, Monuments and Memorials of the Holodomor, published by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press in cooperation with Academic Bookstore in September 2021. Congratulations. Her talk is entitled Holodomor Survivor Testimonies in the Process of Building Monuments in Canada. Dr. Świątek, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sophia, for a kind introduction, and it's my pleasure and honor to be a part of this conference. And I want to thank you for all of participants and all people who share us right now. And I try to share my second screen. One second. Excellent. I have some technical problems. I just help myself. So in a broader context, the subject of my presentation fits into the study of the role of the witness and his or her memories in the process of memory transmission, the process of the formation of memory communities, the impact of witnesses' memories on the emerging representation of the past. Today's purpose of my presentation is to discuss the issues of two examples of monumental representations. I will also be interested in the role of the memory communities, Holodomor witnesses, and their testimonies in the process of creating Holodomor monuments in Canada. As example, to illustrate my considerations, I choose two monuments, one in Edmonton and the other in Mycak. The designs of these monuments were assembled for the competition, and in both cases, the person of the Holodomor witness will be important. Before I reflect my main topic, I need to briefly contextualize my deliberations. And it's necessary to refer to how the Holodomor's memory was transmitted to the communities of memory outside of Soviet Ukraine in the 1940s, 1980s. At that time, the memory of the Holodomor was cultivated by people and communities who, for the most part, did not experience this event. Hence, it's necessary to consider how individuals undertook and synthesized experiences transferred from the first and even second hand to forming their own identity. Marian Hirsch first addressed questions about individuals' involvement to hereditary memory, which they grew up with. This experience was communicated to them emotionally, that it seems to be the foundation of their own memory. Another scholar, Katarzyna Kaniowska, referring to this concept, completed it with her own understanding in relation not so much to individuals as to social groups. For Kaniowska, post-memory is not only the memory experienced by someone else, but the memory of the second generation, which, having not lived through the experience captured by memory, is doomed to define their own identity on the basis of not their own past experience. Post-memory is an extension of the memory of witness and participants for the past reality, and shapes contemporary thinking and knowledge about their self and the world of individuals and communities who have this memory. Moreover, in her understanding, post-memory is also knowledge about the past, which is built on the empathic reconstruction of others' experience. Post-memory, therefore, must be a narrative that is accepted and assimilated. Members of the memory community become the confidants of the generation that experienced the formation event with its authentic experience, which trigger emotions and generate empathy with properties and bind and consolidate the group. In the case of Ukrainian communities in North America, the sense of indebtedness stems from empathy, compassion, and even a desire to make sense of the suffering and revere the victims of the Holodomor, at least, in the symbolic sense of the word, by giving testimony in public about the experience passed on. Symbolic because it's a testimony of a testimony passed down through the generation of post-memory. As with many other cultures of memory of the 20th century traumas, Holodomor monuments are meant to arouse emotions in the viewer: empathy towards the victims, compassion for the survivors, and anger towards the perpetrators. However, in order to properly communicate with the recipient, the creator must manage to convey their idea in a form that is comprehensible for a viewer who does not tackle the problems of art memory on a daily basis. Most architectural metaphors are implicit and mixed, and most often they are based on anthropomorphic figuration. A symbol in architecture is a scene or an object that represents another object or concept. The information conveyed by the symbol is determined with a code or through a social contract. The experience of symbols provokes an emotional, most often unconscious reaction resulting from the contrast between the relative simplicity for the object and the potential complexity of the meaning that the symbol carries. Symbols in art function on many different levels, depending on what beliefs and customs inspire the artists. Symbolic images can quite easily take on different meanings in different people. Expressing traumas or traumatic memories associated with a particular experience is always challenging. Visual representation of trauma are not usually created in emerge as an intellectual and therefore a creative attempt to overcome trauma and conduct a dialogue with yourself or your contemporaries about lived traumatic experience. In the post-memory generation, this is also reinforced by the sense of the sacred mission of paying the debt, as has already been mentioned. In my opinion, creating the empathic, emotional representation of the Holodomor is not possible without referring to the witness's experience. From my research on monumental representation of the Holodomor, which I described in the last monograph, Eternal Memory, as Sophia mentioned, it also appeared that the symbolic figure of the Holodomor witness appears in the shadow of almost every concept of building a monument. The two cases that I would like to discuss today are two completely different examples of witness involvement or memories of witness in the erection of a monument. The first example is a monument in Edmonton, and here the author of the project, Ludmila Temerte, is a part of the Holodomor post-memory generation. She inherits her family memory and creates a representation of the Holodomor for generations like her. The second example is a project designed by Roman Kovar in Winnipeg. He's also an artist who did not experience the Holodomor, but thanks to witnesses' memories, he managed to create a monument representing the Holodomor for the community of memory that founded it. In 1983 in Edmonton, on the initiative of Bogdan Shulakevich and the Ukrainian-Canadian Professional and Business Club of Edmonton, a competition for the design of a commemorative monument to the victims of the Holodomor was announced. Lydia and Bogdan Shulakevich underscored that the key goals in building a Holodomor monument on the occasion of the 50th anniversary were commemorate the tragedy through a tangible monument, to publicize the subject of the Holodomor among successive generations of Ukrainian Canadians and to educate the non-Ukrainian community. As all of us know, the jury chose as the winner the bold modernist design of Ludmila Temerte, which they named the Broken Life Cycle. But not all of us know why an artist born outside Ukraine takes up the subject of the Holodomor. Let us also add that this is a topic distant from the artistic interest. From an article published in the newspaper Home in Ukraine, we learned that the artist's mother was a Holodomor survivor. In other interviews, she recalled, "I understood how much I was defined by my parents' history, even though I did not live through it. I wanted to honor those silent victims of this a crime against humanity." In a private interview, Temerte mentioned that she designed the sculpture to be made of aluminium because the competition rules, since she wanted to material that would reflect the sun to further enhance the symbolic nature of the transition of a new life. She chose aluminium. She mentioned that if she were to realize the design as a sculpture, she would have chosen crystal glass as the most appropriate material. In discussing her motivation and artistic inspiration, Temerte indicated that the monument is meant to honor survivors who managed to preserve their humanity despite experiencing the collapse of values and morality in the face of genocide. The monument also provides some closure to her family Holodomor experience, a form of walking thought loss by means of its symbolic and non-literal representation. By the way, Lydia and Bogdan Szulakewicz received some letters with thanks from the Holodomor witnesses, Holodomor survivors, which was presented at the opening ceremony. But voices of opposition were also heard with Ukrainian cycles, although in the case in relation to Zli and its work. Letters appeared in the Ukrainian press that criticized the selected design and proposed alternative solutions. One such letter sent to the newspaper Nowy Szlak and sealed as Landu criticized the decision behind the jury choice. He wrote, "If I may comment, the monument will speak to no one. It amounts to nothing more than a transferring of the modernist symbolic art of degradation and monstrosity into the sphere of immortalizing our national evils. For those afflicted with symbolic fever, the terrible and unforgettable tragedy of Ukraine in 1933 may be expressed symbolically." And so on. Of course, in a December issue of the newspaper, another critical letter appeared. Lyashenko was negatively inclined toward the monument's entire classified, especially regarding the symbolism of the extant heads. He wrote, "The question is, what will the rising of arms upward mean? A prized arm can signal submission to the enemy, voting at the meeting, saying goodbye to friends departing to some train, boat or other form of transportation, or hello on their arrival. If someone had seen or experienced the tragedy of Ukrainian people where on the sidewalks of industrialized cities lay a mother with their teenage children in various horrific poses and other Ukrainians like them of every age. Those criticism of Temertay's design touch upon the key issue of how the Holodomor should be remembered and whether it's possible to create a monumental representation that meets the expectations of the entire denominationally and politically varied Ukrainian Canadian community. Media discussion centered on the question of an appropriate and dignified memorialization of the witnesses. It can never be a complete. I think that it can never be a complete depiction of loss. In fact, due to the art inability of figuratively represent the trauma without moralization and stigmatization of the perpetrators, abstract forms will offer artists the widest possible variety of expression. And in the case of the monument by Radboud Temertay, the monument is a homage to survivors who found the inner resources to appreciate life despite their complicated biographical experience. It's interesting to look at the polemic voices whose authors are not people speaking on behalf of the Holodomor generation, the context of the experience of witnesses and their need to commemorate the Holodomor or erase the Holodomor experience from memory. The monument in Edmonton's urban space was the first instance of moving beyond Ukrainian diaspora cycles in cultivating the memory of the Holodomor in 1980s, and it also inspired Ukrainian communities in Winnipeg to create similar monuments. The Winnipeg monument was designed by the second prize winner of the Edmonton competition, the Ukrainian-Canadian sculptor Roman Ivan Koval. It was officially unveiled on June 24, 1948, near Winnipeg City Hall. Roman Ivan Koval was a creator of chiefly sacral, monumental, and decorative works. In the center of Roman Koval's composition, entered into the competition is a figure of a mother and child cast in bronze. He did not experience the Holodomor personally. He came from Eastern Galicia, which was within Polish borders in the time of the famine. He learned of the famine from press reports in newspaper Diło. published in Lviv, and from the first-hand accounts of people he met later, already in the diaspora. He commented on his conceptualization of the monument as follows. It occurred to me that women suffered from famine the most. It was they who were always responsible for preparing meals. I know that the responsibility for the evil done lies with the regime that later tried to sweep the course of events under the carpet. On one day, the idea to represent the regime in the form of pincers came to me. I imagined a suffering mother with a child next to her asking for food. In writing about the Winnipeg monument, Miroslav Shkandriy emphasized that in the devising the concept cover recalled the testimony of a militian man involved in the arrest of a woman accused of cannibalism. The account shocked the artist and stayed with him for years. According to the artist's son, Bogdan Kowal, his father really believed that he could convey the essence of the tragedy most successfully through the image of a mother and child enclosed in a tight, constricting space of totalitarian power. In his view, no one before or since has been able to tell the tragedy of the Holodomor so simply, without resorting to the shock value of human suffering and drama or expressive tears and pathos. The Winnipeg Ukrainian community saw the monument's construction as a means of declaring that the Holodomor was a punishment for Ukrainian struggles for independence. As one of the articles announcing the monument's construction states, you can see in the slide, the monument to the victims of the Holodomor in Ukraine in the very heart of Winnipeg is not a question of honor for our whole community, no, for each of us individually. It is to be unveiled at a specific moment and will constitute a permanent reminder for Ukrainian and of those martyred by the Moscow execution. The monument construction committee modified Roman Kowal concept exactly to correspond with their notions of what need to be communicated to viewers, both Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian. The monument does reflect the dialogue between the community and the artists who belong to it. The confluence of their respective visions, presumed given the lack of community opposition to Kowal design, was possible because the sculptor referenced traditional symbols, while also open space for personal interpretation. For some, the woman featured on the monument represents Ukraine, embracing all of the Holodomor victims. For others, she is a famine-stricken mother or despair seeking salvation. These interpretative possibilities follow in my mind for the fact that Kowal built the monument to honor the dead person, victims, rather than the survivors, as was the case with Temertay work. And now some of my conclusions. A look at the monuments of the Holodomor in the 1980s, with which the mass erection of monuments will only begin. It's very interesting because witnesses of the Holodomor are still alive, for whom the commemoration of the Holodomor is important. The Holodomor is art does not yet have its own style, characteristic representation, and the creation of such representations confronts the witnesses and their experience on the one side with the memory gatekeepers, on the other, as representatives of the community of memory and their own memory posts. An example of such kind of discussion could be seen in the process of the Holodomor monument in Edmonton. Witnesses' memories also become an inspiration for artists who have not experienced the Holodomor personally. Their search for artistic symbols for their nation's tragedy leads them to the memories of those who experienced famine, as was the case with Roman Kowal, who created one of the most historical monumental representation of the Holodomor. And thank you for your attention. I'm sorry. And for those who want to know more about Holodomor monuments and memorials in the world, my some kind of product placement here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your talk. Our next panelist is Charley Boerman, a PhD candidate at Radboud University in Nijmegen, Netherlands. Her research project, titled Framing Famines, Memory, Museums, and Visual Culture, explores the visual and material memory cultures of 19th century Finnish famines, the Ukrainian Holodomor of 32-33, and the Greek famine of 1941-44 that occurred during the occupation by the Axis powers in World War II. Her talk is entitled Gender in the Cinematic Treatment of the Holodomor. Charley, you have the floor.
Thank you. And before I start, I want to thank the previous two panelists for their amazing and very insightful presentations, and the organizers of this conference, and especially Oksana Finnick, for organizing it with such care. I'm speaking to you from Amsterdam, where we're in another lockdown, so it's really nice to have something nice to do on a Friday evening. I will jump right in, considering the time. So after the release of the Ukrainian film Hunger 33, and I'll use the English titles of these films throughout my presentation. It took more than 2 decades for another cinematic treatment of the Holodomor to be released. In the last several years, however, 3 films have been released in close succession: the Ukrainian film The Guide, the Canadian film Bitter Harvest, and the international production Mr. Jones, which was directed by Agnieszka Holland. So in this paper, I will discuss how the Holodomor has been narrated and visualized in these films. And I will focus especially on the gender dynamics of famine representation and what Margaret Kelleher has called or calls defeminization of famine. And I will look at the function of women as famine signifier, as well as an allegory for the nation in my analysis. So I think it ties in quite nicely with the previous presentation. And Oksana Kiss, who I'm sure everyone knows her research, and she focuses on women's experience of famine. She argues that despite the prevalence of female imagery in Holodomor commemoration, quote, promoting a public discourse of Ukrainian women as the stereotypically passive victims of historical cataclysm is not only incorrect, but destructive in that it ultimately dislodges the possibility of recognizing women as agents of historical events, end quote. So my aim is to analyze the feminization of famine in cinematic representations of the Holodomor, but to also contribute to a critique of the one-dimensional role assigned to women in narrations of this past. And I focus on film because of its ability to shape how we think of the past, and especially with the 3 films. So the newest films I will look at, I think for a lot of people, it will be their first encounter with the history of the Holodomor. So memory scholar Alison Landsberg argues that the conjunction between a person and a historical narrative presented at an experiential site, such as at a film screening, can lead viewers to take on the presented narrative as prosthetic memory, so as adopted memory. And this prosthetic memory has the ability to shape one's subjectivity and politics. And it's neither inherently progressive nor reactionary, but it is a powerful way of memory making and requires careful analysis. And I also know that there's a lot of historians at this conference. So while I do bear in mind historical accuracy or inaccuracy when looking at these films, my aim in the analysis is not necessarily to test them against accepted notions by professional historians. And I'm rather in line with the historian Robert A. Rosenstone. I propose to look at what kind of historical world these films create through their rules of engagement. And within these rules of engagement, I look at focalization, so meaning through whom the narrative is told, and in turn to what perspective the audience has access. And this awareness of focalization is important because it illuminates power structures between characters. So after all, we'll have access to one sort of story, not to the others. So in these three films, they all have as a central theme the importance of witnessing and the secrecy and denial surrounding the famine that has become known as the Holodomor. So the male protagonists are all witnesses and concerned with communicating the reality of the famine to the outside world. So Peter Shamrock, the child protagonist in the guide, carries these documents that he wants to publish because they prove the intentionality behind the famine. The artistically inclined protagonist Yuri in Bitter Harvest wants to witness through his art, and real-life journalist Garrett Jones in Mr. Jones, of course, pays witness through his journalism. When looking at these film slogans, such as Mr. Jones's "The truth can't remain hidden forever," or the motivations as expressed by directors in interviews, where they link, for example, the Holodomor to present-day Russian aggression, or fake news and Trumpian politics. It is also not difficult to see these films as themselves sort of paying witness to the famine the same way that their protagonists do, or at least these films attempt to do that, I think. So I first look at Mr. Jones. And Garrett Jones, the protagonist of the film, is probably the most famous outsider witness to the Holodomor. And he actually appears in many other films about the Holodomor, but as maybe an unnamed character, but wearing sort of the same glasses. And we'll see that later in the presentation. So the film, which chronicles his investigation, is fast-paced, except for the middle section, which features his time spent in Soviet Ukraine. And through temporal and spatial dislocation, Jones and the viewers get lost in the snowy and desolate Ukrainian landscape. And here Jones encounters what in the context of the cultural representation of the Irish famine has been called famine tableau. So narratively unintegrated and iconic famine scenes. And it is through these encounters that Jones begins to grasp the severity of the event, all the while attempting to document what he witnesses. And then perhaps one of the most impressive scenes, he comes upon a deceased mother and a desperate child that are collected by corpse collectors, while the child increasingly cries louder and louder. And as you can see in the screenshots, the scene is focalized through Jones through an eye-line match shot. So there's sort of a close-up of his face, and then the scene cuts to what he supposedly sees. And he attempts to document the scene and to photograph it, but he's unable to. He lowers his camera and he remains in the frame as the corpse collectors leave and exit the frame. So the scene of the mother and the child is too tragic for Jones to document, but it is deployed by the director to signal the severity of the famine to him and through the audience, to the audience through him. So I think there's several interesting things that happen in this scene. First, as I said, the eye-line match shot, the scene is focalized through Jones. And as with the rest of the film, it takes on this outsider witness perspective. And secondly, the ultimate horror of the famine is visualized through the breakdown of maternal care. And this recalls representation of famine and disaster more generally. So when disaster strikes, it's often pictures of women and children, and particularly those of mother and child, which fill newspapers and newsreels. And in fiction as well, female characters and bodies are used to elicit pity and compassion and to signify heroism and survival, as well as horror and death, and to give shape to what has been called the inexpressibility of famine. So Margaret Kelleher calls this the feminization of famine. And she argues that the spectacle of famine is, quote, frequently constructed through female figures, its traces inscribed on hunger-ravaged, unclothed bodies. Women's function as bearer of meaning possesses a number of aspects. Most obviously, the maternal body displays the absence of nourishment, the failure of primal shelter and sustenance. The individual figure stands for a general breakdown or crisis, not only in society, but in representation itself, end quote. So the tableau of the mother and child for Mr. Jones does not stand alone, but is embedded in a representative repertoire through which the mother and child are used to depict the spectacle of famine, both in the past and still today. And I will now look more at the gender dynamics. So this motive of the mother and child as witnessed by a man is also present in Bitter Harvest. So in Bitter Harvest, as in Mr. Jones, unnamed female characters function as emblems of famine, whilst male protagonists witness and interpret the scenes. So Bitter Harvest chronicles the events of the early 1930s through the lives of two young lovers, Yuri and Natalka. And in the film, most male characters die fighting Soviets, whereas most female victims are nameless, non-recurrent figures who feature in the background and succumb to malnutrition. So the men are depicted as fighters and active agents, whereas women or female figures remain passive and function as free-floating famine signifiers. So when Yuri travels to Kiev to study at the Art Academy, he has his first encounter with famine, which he is unaware. So here he meets this journalist, as you can see here, which looks a lot like Gareth Jones. And Yuri is drawing on the train, and the journalist compliments him on his drawing, but also informs him that he should use his talents to convey the truth about the famine. And Yuri is confused because he doesn't know what this means. And at that moment, they hear a knock on the door, or on the window of the carriage. And through the curtain, they see a desperate mother, you see here, with a child begging for help, for food. But the train conductor closes the curtains, and Jones looks knowingly at Yuri. So a few scenes later, Yuri is well aware of the famine and what's happening. And as he walks through Kiev, he witnesses many dead and starving people. And at some point, he comes upon a child who begs for help with his mother, but she has already died. And then in the next shot, we see Yuri drawing their figures, and they're much more skeletal, graphic, and naked than what we have seen prior. So as the Jones figure in Bitter Harvest suggested, Yuri is using his talents to convey the truth about the famine, but he does so based on the sort of exaggerated figure of the mother and child. And David Lloyd, also when writing about representation of the Irish famine, argues that the spectacle of starving bodies and the total subordination of famine victims to nature and bare life, quote, forces the viewer to the very threshold of humanity, to the sail that divides the human and the non-human, or rather, to the boundary that marks the division between the human and the non-human within the human, end quote. So famine victims are often depicted through women and children, not only to elicit sympathy, but also because these already occupy an ambiguous position between nature and culture. And this liminality provides the spectator with the possibility to distance the famine victim from common humanity, even when simultaneously extending sympathy. And this distance or separation between spectator and victim is often made literal by framing the famine victims as within their cabin, whilst the spectator gazes upon them from the threshold of a doorway or through their carriage window. And I think this literal boundary is echoed really clearly in the scene in which the begging woman is only filmed from within the carriage, and she's framed also by the window and the curtains. And as in Mr. Jones, the scene is focalized through a male witness, which maintains the literal boundary between the male agent, the male witness, and the female famine victim, who remains the object of his gaze. And Rebecca Jinks, in her work on genocide films, notes, quote, victims and their testimonies often appear in the Western protagonist account in an evidentiary illustrative function, selected and excerpted in order to back up or confirm the narrator's description of events, end quote. And in the literary works Gallagher discusses, women also more often than not feature as these nameless and non-recurring figures, as a tableau or as an icon of famine, rather than as characters with personal developments who negotiate new realities. So in the scenes I briefly described, the horror of famine is depicted through the motive of a mother unable to care for her child, and is gazed upon and interpreted by a male witness, Gareth Jones and Yuri respectively. So in the mise-en-scene of the film, the motive works to progressively signal the severity of the famine to the protagonist and to the audience through them. So the male witnesses are active interpreters, and the feminized famine figure of the mother and child remains a passive symbol, a free-floating famine signifier through which to communicate the reality of famine while simultaneously keeping it at a distance. So before concluding this paper, I will briefly look at two named female characters and how they figure as allegories in the construction of the Holodomor in two films, namely Natalka in Bitter Harvest and Orisha in The Guide. And like quite some work has already been done on the use of female form as allegory for the nation, and Olga Papash has also analyzed this when talking about the film Hunger 33. So Margaret Kelleher, again, she notes that in later retellings of the Irish famine, much more than in contemporaneously written works, female victims often gain an allegorical function, quote, embodying the fate of Mother Earth, the motherland, or even nation, end quote. And although Keller does not explain why she thinks it's the case, I speculate, and this is really speculating, that this is likely because in later retellings of the past, these are already embedded in collective memory and hegemonic readings of this past. So these characters gain an allegorical function within a dominant interpretation that has already been circulated also in other cultural forms. So these are Natalka and Orisia, and they both feature as love interests in these respective films, and they mostly derive their importance from their relationships to these and other men in the films. They're both peasant women featured in traditional embroidered clothing, and at times, as you can see, they're depicted wearing a floral crown, which is reminiscent of spring and fertility rituals. And both the traditional clothing as well as the floral crown, I think, also connects them then to the fertility of the Black Earth in Ukraine. And through the cultural construction and connection between women, their bodies, and ideas of the motherland, and then in combination with these ethnic signifiers, I see them as embodiments of Ukraine in these films, or that they function this way. Orisia is brutally murdered by party activists looking for her lover. And Natalka is beaten and sexually assaulted by the film's main antagonist, Soviet Commissar Sergei. So I think both women then start out functioning as a representative of an idealized and untarnished Ukraine, but then they become individual embodiments of the structural violence and oppression committed through these Soviet policies. So their private lives are made representative of public destinies. And I think I still have enough time to talk about the sexual violence experienced by Natalka. So Natalka in this film is aware that Sergei finds her attractive, and she fakes a response to his advances in order to get close enough to him to kill him. And when he realizes, Sergei attempts to rape her. And this provides a very spectacular storyline, but it doesn't really engage, I think, with the gendered experience of women during the Holodomor. But I think it rather works to emphasize Natalka's status as a virtuous and uncompromised sort of Ukrainian woman and embodiment of Ukraine. And I think this is emphasized through the costume design in the film. So when Natalka enters Sergei's cabin, she wears the embroidered dress that she's seen wearing throughout the film. But during their dinner, she wears this low-cut, modern, more sexy dress that he has gifted her. But then when she returns to the family and explains, much to their relief, that she did not dishonor the family, she's once again seen wearing the embroidered dress, again emphasizing her virtuousness and her purity, her unblemishedness. And interestingly enough, I think this story is quite reminiscent of a testimony recounted by Oksana Kiss, a woman who was quite similarly to Natalka, pursued by a head of a kolkhoz. And she has said, quote, "There was no food, my legs and my children's legs began swelling. I had no information about my husband even, so I gave myself to that bastard for 2 sacks of millet," end quote. So rather than explore the lives of women during the Holodomor, or offer a window through which to speak of and explore the traumatic gendered experiences of women during this period, I think Bitter Harvest rather offers a moralistic rejection of the survival strategies particular to women, such as sexual barter. And patriotism and the constructed connection between the female character, her body, and the nation motherland leads to a classification of sexual barter as national treachery. So in conclusion, I see these female figurations of famine and the motive of mother and child function to represent famine in these films, but tell us little of their realities, lived experiences, and agency. The gender dynamic between female victims and male spectators or witnesses creates a further division between the victims and witnesses, and in turn separates the viewer from victims as well. The women who are named function as allegories and embody already existing narratives of the Holodomor. And finally, although the Holodomor is a unique event, and although this is, of course, often repeated in commemorations and awareness campaigns and historical research, it is interesting to note that these films do rely on quite universal and established motifs to visualize and narrate the tragedy and link to other representations of other famines. And I have here a brief slide with my bibliography. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And you've come in a minute early too, so thank you. I'm going to keep moving quickly. Our next presenter is Dr. Olga Andriewsky. She's an associate professor in the Department of History at Trent University. She teaches and researches in the area of late imperial and Soviet history. She's currently working on the social memory of the Holodomor. Recent publications include Remembering the Holodomor, Eyewitness and Survivor Accounts of the Early Cold War Period, 1947 to 55, and Towards a Decentered History, the Study of the Holodomor and Ukrainian Historiography Contextualizing the Holodomor. She has also written numerous articles on identity and politics in late imperial Russia. Her talk is entitled The Hidden Social Memory of the Holodomor, Non-Ukrainians Remember Famine in Ukraine. You have it right there. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that my microphone was on. Okay, here we go. I thank you to the organizers for allowing me to piggyback onto this session. I'm going to move the discussion from public memory and public representations to what I call the hidden social memory of the Holodomor. The notion of a distinctly Ukrainian famine, the idea that Ukraine and Ukrainians were specially targeted, has been contested among scholars for many decades, ever since the publication of Robert Conquest's book in 1986. What's often been overlooked, however, is the distinctive place which Ukraine occupied in the official all-union discourse, both before and during the Holodomor. Here we go. Pravda, for example, carried news and stories about Ukraine on an almost daily basis. And interestingly, Pravda and Izvestia consistently used that term, Ukraina, Ukraine, rather than Ukrainian SSR or Ukrainian Republic. Probably no other area of the Soviet Union outside of Moscow and Leningrad received as much attention. And at the start of the first 5-year plan, Ukraina was explicitly identified as a decisive region, critical to the success of the socialist transformation. By the winter of 1929-1930, however, the tone of this public all-union discourse had shifted dramatically. Ukraine was now increasingly portrayed in the all-union press as a problem area in terms of agricultural production and as a particular site of political conflict. Now, this is not to suggest, of course, that there weren't other sites of conflict, but from 1930 on, Ukraine became to epitomize all of the difficulties with the socialist transformation of the countryside. The trial of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, Spilka Vyzvolenia Ukraina, in early 1930 received extensive coverage in the all-union press over the course of many days and many weeks. And it was actually at Stalin's insistence that this happened. He wanted maximum publicity. So this trial was, in effect, a kind of all-union event. Now, the trial is sometimes portrayed as a parallel process to collectivization and dekulakization, but it was actually intimately linked to what was going on in the countryside. This was the height of rural resistance, as Olga Bertelsen described yesterday in her paper. The defendants, mainly Ukrainian socialists and intellectuals, were accused of, among other things, of planning to sabotage the economy, of preparing popular uprisings, of discrediting Soviet authority, of trying to restore the rule of the landlords. Of course, no direct mention was made of the massive peasant resistance to collectivization or of the coercion, repression, and political violence that was being employed at that very moment. The shortcomings were blamed on counter-revolutionaries in the Ukrainian Commissariat of Agriculture, in the party, and various other Soviet institutions who were working along with the kulaks to revive the capitalist order. And by 1932, the bourgeois nationalists, Petlurites, and kulaks, according to this narrative, had infiltrated the collective farms as administrators, accountants, and members of village Soviets. The official Soviet discourse, I think, provides us with a sense of the political atmosphere in which dekulakization, collectivization, and grain procurement were carried out and explained. The political atmosphere in which decisions were taken in 1932-33, and in which hunger was experienced both within and beyond the Ukrainian Republic. The national interpretation of the Holodomor, I would suggest, had its roots here. It was Terry Martin who first noted, rather ironically, that Stalin was in fact the first person to give the famine a national interpretation. The question I'm asking in this paper is, how widely was a kind of national/geographic interpretation of the famine shared, and to what degree, if any, did non-Ukrainians in the Soviet Union associate the famine of 32-33 with Ukraine? Did it extend beyond the borders of the Ukrainian Republic? And if so, how was this association formed and shaped and transmitted? Well, trying to recover what non-Ukrainians knew and thought at the time, especially those living beyond the borders of the Ukrainian Republic, seems like an almost impossible task. But there are clues and fragments, surprising clues and fragments of evidence that suggest that the idea of a Ukrainian famine was much more widely held than we might assume. In this paper, I analyzed one of the few known sources for the study of non-Ukrainians outside the Ukrainian Republic, that is the Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System. The Harvard Project was the largest of several early Cold War efforts. I think many of you are familiar with the project. It was meant to exploit Soviet refugees for research purposes. And between 1950 and 53, a team of social scientists from Harvard conducted about 700 interviews. The aim of the project was to study how the Soviet Union worked. They weren't interested in the life stories of the refugees. Well, the Harvard collection is, for many, many, many reasons, a problematic source, and especially a problematic source for the study of the Holodomor. And in the interests of time, I won't go into the many flaws of the Harvard study. But the one thing worth keeping in mind, something I've already mentioned, is that the interviewers were working with a set list of questions, and they weren't interested in the life stories of the refugees, much less the Holodomor. The interviewers were there to extract information about how the Soviet system worked, and any discussion of the famine was viewed as a kind of digression. And yet, as we know from the interviewers themselves, refugees spoke about the Great Famine of 32-33, and they spoke about it repeatedly and passionately. Well, hunger and the search for food in general is a theme that runs virtually through every interview in the study. The word hunger, famine, and starvation, all translated into Russian, of course, as golod, appear in the transcripts 1,643 times. Some of the respondents spoke about the famine of 1921. Others remembered starving during the German occupation. But in the interviews of many of the respondents, both Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian, rural and urban, within Ukraine and beyond, the early 1930s emerged as a kind of distinct period, often referred to simply as the years of hunger, the years of famine. Hunger was a near universal experience, and even those who weren't directly affected often situated their life stories within a larger social memory of hunger and starvation. So, for example, one interviewee, an actor from Moscow, noted, quote, "We were well off. Even during the terrible years of hunger, we did manage fairly well." As the transcripts reveal, the years of hunger and famine were associated above all with the situation in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent with the Kuban and the Don Cossack regions. Virtually every refugee, whether Ukrainian or non-Ukrainian, who had lived in the Ukrainian SSR mentioned the famine of 32-33 in the course of the interview, even though they weren't being asked about it. One of the refugees interviewed by the Harvard team was in fact an Odessa lawyer, a self-identified Russian who had defended women charged with cannibalism in 1933. But I think most significantly, the Harvard interviews indicate that in the 1930s, rumors of, quote, famine in Ukraine, as distinct from famine in the countryside, reached well beyond the borders of the Ukrainian Republic. In some cases, this information was carried by individuals who'd been sent to Ukraine in an official capacity. One of the respondents, a 39-year-old Russian from Moscow, recalled, when I was a student during the summer, I was sent to do practical work in different places in Ukraine, and there myself saw heaps of corpses lying around. And I also knew this hunger had been artificially created. Stalin exported all the grain from Ukraine. Information seemed to travel especially rapidly in family circles. So another respondent described the shock of realizing that people in Ukraine were being deliberately starved. And I quote, "The first real shock came to me in 33 when I began to hear about the famine in Ukraine. We were living in Moscow at the time, but we had many relatives in Ukraine. People who had fled from Ukraine would tell us about what was going on there. Of course, they weren't allowed to flee, but hungry men are desperate men. I heard that people were bloated from hunger." As this account and others make clear, it was people fleeing to the Russian Republic from Ukraine who helped spread the word. They fled to Moscow, they fled to Leningrad, they escaped to Crimea, they made their way to the Caucasus, they went wherever they thought they might have some chance to survive. A Gulag inmate, a Russian, learned of the famine when Ukrainians who had been released began returning to the labor camp in the far north after their release in 1933, because there was no food in Ukraine. And it wasn't just starving Ukrainian peasants who were on the move. We know from Anna Sternsitz's research that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews who were also affected by starvation moved to Moscow and Leningrad and other cities during these years. So rumors of the famine in Ukraine, as these interviews attest, really traveled far and wide. One Russian peasant from Siberia who was interviewed in this project said, "In our region, it was not as bad as in Ukraine." Similarly, one of the respondents, a 45-year-old Georgian, noted in passing, "In 1932, our harvests were rather good. We went hungry, but not like in Ukraine, not that extreme." And remember, these people were not asked to talk about the famine. A woman from Belarus made much the same point. Quote, "I know that in Ukraine, many people died because there was no food. This sort of thing did not take place among us, although many people were hungry." End of the quote. She'd heard stories of the Holodomor from a close friend of hers, a party member who had been sent to Ukraine to help collect grain. Her friend couldn't come to terms with what she had seen, particularly evidence of cannibalism, and later committed suicide. Not everyone who heard the rumors grasped the seriousness of the situation at the time. One Muscovite, a professional photographer, remembered hearing rumors about famine in Ukraine, but just simply didn't believe them. Nor were the interviewees necessarily sympathetic to the victims. One Russian worker blamed the famine in Ukraine, and he used that term, quote, "on wealthy kulaks who did not want to feed the cities and on incompetent collective farm administrators." And he said, "Millions of people died because of this famine." Another explained the famine on the lack of resourcefulness on the part of the Ukrainians. And I quote, "When the famine came, the Russians left all their villages, but in Ukraine, they all sat at home because the land was better and there was more of it." Yet even from these examples, we can see, I think, the degree to which the respondents thought about the famine of 32-33 in regional and geographic, and not just in class terms. The famine in the minds of many of those who had lived through those years, whether it was in Kiev, in Leningrad, or Moscow, had a defined location and a distinct geography. There were even those among the non-Ukrainians who offered, There were even those among non-Ukrainians who offered a national interpretation of the Holodomor. Indeed, one respondent, a self-identifying Jew who had been born in Kiev, but who had spent most of his adult career in the Russian Republic working in a factory administration, predicted, quote, "Ukrainians will never forget how the Bolsheviks destroyed whole villages and districts. In 1932, the Bolsheviks turned guns and tanks on the people and created an artificial famine. Whole future generations of Ukrainians will remember this." Well, the Harvard study, I think, provides a glimpse into what I call the hidden social memory of the Holodomor, a memory that was transmitted and shared beyond the borders of Ukraine by the considerable population displacements and shifts of this era, not to mention the mass mobilization of personnel required to carry out the large-scale state campaigns of forcible grain collection. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much to all of the presenters for those interesting and insightful talks. We turn now to the discussants. We'll have both discussants speak, and then we'll have responses and questions. Our first discussant is Dr. Norman Naimark, who is the Robert and Florence McDonnell Professor of East European Studies at Stanford University. He is also a senior fellow by courtesy of the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. His most recent book is entitled Stalin and the Fate of Europe, the Post-War Struggle for Sovereignty, Harvard 2019. I was going to say you don't need an introduction, but Dr. Naimark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I should say that I've been instructed explicitly not to comment on Olga's paper, but hi, Olga, nice to see you, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. I have 10 minutes, it's not very long. So let me just say that I appreciate all the papers that I read and the papers at the conference. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I was not aware of the growing diversity and complexity of what might be called the Holodomor studies, the extent to which it's reached into kind of cultural and linguistic areas. And it's quite invigorating to see papers like this. We're not talking anymore about whether there was a Holodomor or not, whether there was genocide or not, but rather, dealing in very sophisticated ways with the aspects of the representation of Holodomor, which is what these three papers are about. So let me go quickly through the three, just mention a couple of things for each, and then, call it a day, at least for me. So in Sonia's paper about Australia and the various activities of the Australian Ukrainian community, a couple of things occurred to me in terms of questions and issues. One has to do with whether or not she thinks, and I gather you studied as well, the community in Canada, whether there are differences. In other words, are there profound differences between the way, the Ukrainian community, let's say in Australia, thinks about and celebrates or commemorizes the Holodomor and its memory, and in the United States? I mean, how do these communities differ, if they do at all? Or are we just talking really about quite similar developments? I mean, the second question that occurred to me had to do with, obviously there's a kind of period in the development of Holodomor and how the communities think about Holodomor, where they themselves are absorbing the lessons of the Holodomor, and then they want others to absorb it. And this question of genocide is part of that, Holodomor as genocide. And so the issue I wanted to ask you about, and the question, or curious, is how, I mean, I know in the Canadian community, also and to some extent in the American community, there's an effort to reach out to other communities, who have suffered genocide, and that, sometimes, museums are based on as genocide museums. I mean, I had something small to do with the Dallas Museum, which, considers a number of different genocides, including the Ukrainian Holodomor. So has that become part of the Australian scene? To turn now to, Victoria's analysis of the two Holodomor memorials, one in Edmonton and one in Winnipeg, demonstrating, again, the power of the representation of Holodomor among, in this case, Canadian Ukrainian communities involved. What interested me a lot were that these two memorials, came from the same competition. And one was chosen first. That was the one that went up in Edmonton. One was chosen second. That was the one that went up in Winnipeg. And it's interesting, the organizer ended up being chosen third. You might want to say a word or two about that. But do we have access to the papers of these kinds of competitions? I mean, it would seem to me that would be this would be a fascinating study. I mean, we're talking about the 80s. It's not that recent. I mean, and maybe in 10 years or 15 years, we could actually see the papers of all of the discussions by the jury of the various representations that were given in the various, proposals. It would be nice to be able to, analyze those as a way to understand how, people decide to memorialize this set of events. Now, the Temerty Memorial, which won the competition and was erected prominently in Edmonton, is by far the most abstract, obviously, of the memorials. It's very different from the other memorial, which is, in my view anyway, a kind of building on how generally the type of memorial that's being built. And it's not surprising to me that the Temerty Memorial had this opposition. I mean, you listed some of it. I'm sure there's much more. But let me just propose something and see what you think about it. And that is that, I mean, for us, the Holodomor is a natural thing to think about. We accept it. We understand it. Our friends do. Nobody denies it. We don't have that trouble. The larger community is still dealing with such things as denial, right? And denial not just by the Russians, but also denial in the larger, who are the Ukrainians to say they have, that there's genocide there, and maybe there was a famine, So you get denial, as Olga knows, even in the academic community. So I guess my observation is that I don't think necessarily these come from the diversity in the community, which is what you suggested, but it comes more, from a sense that people don't know about the Holodomor and that it's denied. And therefore, an abstract memorial like that, which is hard to interpret. I mean, I confess, I looked at it and I was pleased to see your interpretation and the author's interpretation. But if you'd asked me, it was hard for me to take away from that, anything about Holodomor itself. So, I'm just curious about that. And the other thing is the Kowal statue, which made me think about Charley's paper too, because it is in some ways this classic representation about the Holodomor. You say that Kowal made some concessions to the community in putting up that memorial. I mean, I wonder what concessions there were. because it looks like pretty much the classic representation, of a starving mother and protecting her child. So let me leave it at that. And to go quickly to Charley's paper is very interesting about the 3 films about Holodomor, and focuses mostly on, the gender dynamics going on. And she's right, of course. Nobody's going to contest that most of this representation is about suffering and victimhood of women, sometimes overly simplified and overly stylized. But I confess, and this is the kind of old-fashioned historian speaking, victims of hunger, and especially victims of hunger in Holodomor, were primarily women and children. We know that. And that, these typically motherly roles of feeding, nurturing, sustaining the family, became brutally impossible, during the famine. And other genocides have similar issues that you would talk about. In the Bosnian case, it was Muslim women who were raped. In the case of the Holocaust, Jewish women and children did go to the gas chambers in much larger numbers and earlier than did the men. Armenian women and children were forced to march across the desert, when the men were frequently sometimes just shot originally, or they left the country. So, women are, victims of genocide. And, it's certainly the case that gender roles are complicated and diverse in the Holodomor, that women had many different kinds of reactions, and limiting them, to a picture of starving mothers and children, does become something of a trope in these representations. But it's also a trope, that people understand, and it has some historical veracity. So, I'm sort of caught a little bit in between, this question of representation and what it means historically. I had one quick question about this prosthetic memory. I kept trying to figure out what that was. You called it adopted memory in your talk here and in your paper. I kept thinking, is this fake memory or is it artificial memory? What are we talking about exactly when you're talking about prosthetic memory? Are we doing something wrong in using these films to remember or to think about, to think about the Holodomor? Is it bad of us? To come out of those films feeling the way we do about the Holodomor. What are you saying exactly in using this concept? Finally, I just wanted to mention in the making of Holodomor memory, you're certainly correct, in these conclusions about the films, that certain female characters stand for larger interpretations, of the innocent, Ukraine and Ukrainian people, with the flowers and the peasant costumes, the homogeneous and pure Ukraine versus, the evil of the perpetrators and the Russian perpetrators. We find this, today in trying to deal with Holodomor historically, the very threat of the Russians in Ukraine, as we were talking, right, turns this into a kind of epic of good and evil, of perpetrators and innocent victims. I'm not sure what you do about that, right? But it's worth noting, of course, and this as well as I do, this is part of, building national identity. It's part of how nations are created, and they are created, right? They don't come, already packaged. And this nation creation, strikes me as a lot of what's happening a little bit in these films, even if they're not necessarily made by Ukrainians, and in these mythologies. People are creating a sense of who they are, out of this terrible tragedy that occurred in 1932-33. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Naimark. Some good questions there. I think you guys have all noted them. and we'll start with you answering them when we get to the question period. I will now introduce our second discussant. Dr. Vic Satzewich is professor of sociology at McMaster University and is past president of the Canadian Sociological Association. Over the course of his career, he has published 9 books and over 60 articles on various aspects of immigration and race and ethnic relations in Canada. In 2006, he was awarded the Outstanding Contribution Award by the Canadian Sociological Association. His book, Points of Entry, How Canada's Visa Officers Decide Who Gets In, published by the University of British Columbia Press 2015, won the Canadian Sociological Association's John Porter Prize for the best book in 2016. Dr. Satzewich, the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I have to be honest, I feel like a bit of an outsider at this conference. I'm a sociologist, but I don't do research on the Holodomor. But I am a second generation Ukrainian Canadian, and my parents and grandparents lived many of the experiences that have been discussed and analyzed over the last 2 days at this conference. So this has been quite a heavy 2 days for me, but I appreciate it. I've learned a lot from all of the papers, and they've helped me sort of fill in gaps in my own kind of understanding of my parents and grandparents' biographies and histories. So this has been really quite a moving. So I know I stand between you and Friday night fun or Saturday morning fun, whatever that looks like in the context of COVID. So I'm going to try to be relatively brief in my comments on Olga's paper, but I have to say what a pleasure to read it and to see how she uses the Harvard archive. And until reading the paper, I wasn't aware of the existence of the Harvard Project on the Soviet social system and the interviews that were conducted. I teach a graduate course in historical methods in sociology, and I'm always looking for digitized archival material in this case, digitized oral histories to have students dive into. And I'm really looking forward to figuring out a way to incorporate this archive into some of my teaching. So appreciate that certainly from Olga's paper. So as Olga mentioned, she wants to understand how non-Ukrainians who lived both within and outside Ukraine in the 1930s and who ended up resettling in the West recounted what they understood to be happening in Ukraine. And the question of how non-Ukrainians associated the specificity of the famine geographically or nationally with Ukraine is obviously interesting and important. All recognize that the famine was particularly severe in Ukraine, but Olga notes that there were really differences of opinion associated with attributing causality. Some refugees blamed the authorities, or in some cases the party or the Bolsheviks. But I guess what I thought was interesting and maybe worth commenting on a little bit more, Olga, was that as far as I could tell, Stalin's name comes up relatively infrequently in the attribution of blame. I think it comes up in one of the quotes that you cite. And I know that you're careful to explain that you're not arguing that the purpose of your paper isn't to argue that Stalin set out to kill millions of Ukrainians, but it does strike me as odd that there's a relative silence on Stalin, and I don't know if that's because they were non-Ukrainians, and whether perhaps the Ukrainians who were interviewed in the Harvard Project, were they more likely to attribute blame specifically to Stalin than the non-Ukrainians? So again, I don't know if I want to make too much out of that, but it strikes me that could be something you might want to explore a little bit in a little bit more detail, whether the Ukrainian refugees in that data set were somehow more willing or whatever in sort of attributing blame specifically to Stalin. I know it's hard to do everything in a short paper, but I did want to learn more about the data and the context for how the data collection was organized and how the data was collected. And I know you can't do that in a short paper. And I'm actually going to try and learn more as I do a deeper dive into that archive myself. But Olga mentions that discussing the terror famine was considered off topic or a digression by the Harvard research team. And I guess I want to know a little bit more about why the research team came to that conclusion. Like, why in the 1950s, like 1950, 53, the terror famine was considered a digression for them. I mean, I would have thought that this would be something that would have stood out in terms of wanting to investigate, explore, talk about. Very quickly, I know Olga mentions that this is an incidental collection where the refugees were never specifically asked about the famine of 1932-33. It kind of came up, the respondents raised the issues themselves. And so, and you kind of hint at it a little bit, Olga, in your remarks. But I guess I wanted to know a little bit more about the point in the interviews at which the famine came up, the point in the interviews at which they started to narrate their stories and the famine came up as part of their narration. So what prompted them to talk about famine by the interviews, and what sort of prior conversations led them to sort of make a connection between what and famine. Olga mentions also in the presentation in the paper that the words hunger and famine and starvation appear 1,643 times in the collection and in a number of different contexts. And maybe I'm not actually a quantitative sociologist, but I do kind of wonder about the relative importance of the famine of 1932-33 in relation to the discussion of other forms of other famines and the problem of hunger more generally. And so what place did 1932-33 kind of occupy within the general discourse and narration of hunger and famine? And like, was it 50% of the references, 30%? And it may not matter, but again, there's something about the quantitative side of me that wants to know a little bit more. Again, because I'm a sociologist, I always wonder about the representativeness of the quotes that we use and incorporate into our papers. And I think, maybe a little bit of discussion of how the illustrative quotes were selected and chosen, I think would be useful. And I wonder too, if there might be some value in pushing the analysis of attributing blame a little bit more. You're probably familiar with the good old sociological concept of blaming the victim. And it struck me when I was reading your paper and you were referring to the non-Ukrainians who were blaming Ukrainians in various ways for their own plight. How important were those blaming the victim sort of discourses within the the non-Ukrainian refugees that were being interviewed? And so I think I would like to see a little bit more kind of analysis of that trope within the analysis within the paper. I have some broader questions, but you know what? I think everyone is probably tired and they don't really want to hear me. They want to hear you. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Good questions. I think as chair, I'm going to add a couple of questions onto that list very quickly too, if I may. To Dr. Świątek, did you find a difference between monuments created by those who had a connection to the Holodomor in their family backgrounds, for example, and those who didn't? Is there some sort of qualitative difference between those types of monuments or their use by the community? And do you know what proportion perhaps there are one of the other? That would be obviously an interesting thing globally as well to look into. And Charley, to add to Dr. Naimark's comments, some of which I agreed with in terms of the fact that women were what was left behind after the men were taken away and shot into the gulags and so on, and deeply affected by the Holodomor. And to what extent do you take into account also that Ukraine is a deeply, deeply matriarchal society and culture, and the mother, the figure of the woman is very deeply ingrained in the symbology, and that we don't yet have enough perhaps research out in popular culture for depictions of things like the Babski Bunte, for example. I don't necessarily preclude that there can't be a Holodomor Wonder Woman at some point, but I don't think that that's sort of in the public imagination enough just yet, or that we actually have seen what the details of that were largely enough yet. I feel also like with Natalka, you forgot that red dress is definitely Soviet red, which is how it hit me when I looked at it, and that a very difficult moment in the movie there when she returns. And for both of you, I'm also wondering, there seems to also be here a kind of a narrative or a setup between aesthetics and symbolism. To what extent the monuments and the images that films give us have a certain kind of aesthetic to them, or from a certain kind of aesthetic background, and to what extent they're drawing on or pulling on either their own historic national symbolism or this sort of general symbolism of feminization of famines. Okay, thank you. So let's now turn to the speakers. And I think maybe the first three, if you would like to respond to the questions that Dr. Naimark posed, please go ahead and do so. Jump in.
Should we go in order? Or who would you like to begin?
We can go in order, sure. Let's do that.
Okay. Thank you very much. As I understood it, there were two questions for me, or two issues raised. One was, are there differences really between the communities in Australia and in North America and Canada and the United States in terms of Holodomor commemoration? And the other thing is that have Australian Ukrainians reached out to other non-Ukrainian genocides, kind of in constructing and institutionalizing knowledge and memory? The second question I'd like to answer first, simply because I think I can put it a little bit more briefly, and that is that I don't think so. I don't think that the community here has made bridges, has built bridges with other kind of genocide or post-genocidal kind of communities. And I think that's actually an indication of the fact that the Australian Ukrainian community is very small. And there have never been very many people who are qualified in any particular in any sort of particular area to organize and do things. But I think it's also a sign of the fact that the cultural activity, and I can say this with certainty for the literary activity, which is really my specialty, my area of expertise, has been very self-contained. The literature was written in Ukrainian largely for the Ukrainian readership within the Ukrainian community, and there was never any systematic way of reaching out beyond that to the Australian mainstream. And I think that sort of has been the model for most of the cultural activity, barring, with the exception perhaps of dance, Ukrainian dance. On the question of the differences between the way in which perhaps Holodomor has been commemorated and institutionalized in Australia as opposed to Canada and the United States and perhaps other places. My initial response would be that there are more similarities than there are differences. And I think you can see just from those few newspaper clippings that I was able to show that the Australian community was always aware of what was taking place particularly in Canada, and has had connections and links and tried to make the readership in Australia aware of that. Hence, even Yaris Balan's Holodomor lecture about 2 or 3 years ago. You saw that had a full-page spread in the newspaper here in Sydney. So I think there have been similarities. The question in my mind, though, is whether there were any systematic or structured connections with places elsewhere in the diaspora. And again, I think the answer is no. But that's a question that I would like to take further in my own mind as to whether in organising the commemorations, was there any structured, systematic attempt to reach out to communities elsewhere in the diaspora and liaise with them. My guess is that there wasn't, but that's something that I'd probably like to take further. If you don't mind, I'll just take the opportunity to answer something that I see in the chat. There's a mention here that identifying changes to the commemorative practices in Australia. I did try to bring a little bit of that out, but perhaps I just didn't do as good a job as I thought. Yes, there were changes over the whole 50, 60, 70 years. First of all, you can see a change in the discourse itself, in the sense that in the early years, and I mean, I'm talking after 1949, into the 1950s, you saw the word holod. And I think that one of the early newspaper articles I showed, distinctly that word holod is used. And then, of course, in later years, you see the use of the term Holodomor, once that's been institutionalized as a specific term for genocide, for famine as the Ukrainian genocide. So you do see that kind of change in discourse throughout the commemoration and institutionalization in Australia. But I guess the most obvious change would really be the way in which the community here started, and relatively recently, to turn more to Ukraine itself for information and for models of commemoration. So that, for example, I don't know whether it would have been very noticeable because I had to go through every slide pretty quickly, but the two leaflets that I showed that the information leaflets that the community produced, the first was a black and white one, and the references and the historical references would have all been to those early works, The Conquest and those early books on Holodomor. The second colour leaflet I showed, on the back of the photo, there was a photograph there of Volodymyr Petrovich with his young son. And so already we see, a decade later, the authorities here, the community authorities, are turning more to the National Institute of Memory, run by Petrovich, for the information. You look at the portrait exhibition, staged here first in Australia, and then a year later in the Holodomor Museum in Kyiv. So I think that the greatest change you would really see is the fact that once the institutionalization became more solid in Ukraine, that the community started to turn more to Ukrainian models, hence the lighter candle campaign. I mean, that did not exist when I was a young child. Now that model taken from Ukraine of lighting the candle on the 27th or the 28th of November, that's been sort of recently adopted. So turning more the gaze to Ukraine for models of commemoration. I'll stop there to give everyone else a chance. Thank you.
So it's my turn now. Yeah. Thank you very much for all comments and questions, Professor Naimark. In fact, I could give a separate lecture in response to each of them. in the book, I write a lot about monuments that have not been realized. And discussions between the artists about how to the best commemorate the Holodomor and what Holodomor monument do we need. Here you can see the third winner of this competition. It's the organizer's son project, but he did not find the sponsor and therefore was not realized. The Ukrainian community really wanted to build, the Ukrainian community in Winnipeg really wanted to build a monument by local artists and sponsored Kowal's project. And as I say in my paper, Roman Kowal compromised with the community of memory because he agreed to add an inscription, a fragment of a poem by Taras Shevchenko, written by Taras Shevchenko, and an inscription in three languages about the Holodomor. His competition model was not placed on a pedestal and did not provide any explanations. As for me, the monument cannot say everything, and I agree with you. But it should inspire the viewer to learn about the history it commemorates. It's my personal opinion, and I think that both of this monument is inspired to the study about the Holodomor.
Okay, thank you. Was there more?
No, sorry, I wanted to.
I was just going to you. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Thank you, Professor Naimark, for your very kind and insightful comments. And I'll try to answer them, although I must say I am getting a little bit sort of tired and hazy after a long day of Zoom, and it's midnight here now. So I'll do my very best. So I'll start off with prosthetic memory. So I don't think we're doing anything wrong watching these films. I think it's great that we watch films and that films are being made about the Holodomor, but I do think we need to analyze them carefully because films are so powerful. And I think what Landsberg means when she talks about prosthetic memory, she really likens it to as if you were to wear a prosthetic leg. So it becomes a part of you. So when you see these films and then maybe a month later someone mentions something about famine in Ukraine, you'll see these scenes, right, as if they're your own memories, as if you've almost lived through them. So it's really like inserted in your own sort of memory. So they're very powerful, but they're not necessarily right or wrong. And I think. And it's I think quite similar to what Wiktoria said about post-memory. So people who only have access to events in the past through images, stories, films, photographs. So they're not your own memories. And I think, and this is why I also focused on gender, because I was interested in, so whose memories do we in a way have access to when we watch these films? And it's not the memories of these women. And I think also in a deeply matriarchal society, and also when women and children were a majority of victims, these realities, I think, in these films aren't really dealt with. So they're used as these tropes to emphasize this victimhood and purity. But I would be so interested to see a film that deals with these with women negotiating their new realities. Sophia, to quickly sidetrack and refer to you, Natalka she participates in in the women's protests in Bitter Harvest, right? So that's also the only reference that I saw to this history, and it's very quickly sort of erected. And so I think she is sort of portrayed as a superwoman. But again, I don't think it teaches us so much, or I don't think it's very interesting when thinking about famine and representations of famine, because they remain quite one-dimensional. I understand the sort of the being in the middle, that this trope does do a lot. It elicits a sympathy and compassion, and it really speaks to the imagination. So it definitely pulls people in. who have very little background knowledge on this event. So I think that the trope of mother and child is very, it definitely has a function. There's a reason that it's used almost all over. But I think it can lose its value when thinking about also maybe honoring the tough choices and the realities of people during the Holodomor. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that to give Olga enough time to respond as well. But thank you both for your comments and questions.
Just a quick follow-up, Charley. Are you not then really talking about agency, about those characters having personal agency rather than carrying all of this symbolism? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
So Dr. Andriewsky, please, your response.
Yeah, I thank you very much, Victor, for your comments. I counted 7 questions, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. But a lot of your questions seem to revolve quite justifiably around sort of the methodology of the Harvard study. And the Harvard study is really, really problematic. It's incredibly important. It's the foundational study for Soviet studies in the United States. I mean, the people who participated in these interviews, almost all of them went on to have long careers as political scientists in particular. There weren't any historians among them, and that's kind of interesting in and of itself. But so it's a tremendously important study that produced a lot of work, but they were interested. It was a Cold War project. They were really interested in probing sort of deeper values and how the system worked, not what happened, how are you collectivized, but how does a collective farm work? Is your complaint low pay? Is your complaint boredom? I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. And in the style of the time, they had a really rigid list of questions they had to get through. And so the people who designed the study really wanted to take out those kinds of personal accounts. They wanted to remove any kind of political commentary. They were terrified of the political bias of this refugee population and that it was going to undermine the whole study. So they worked really hard to get around that. So the way it worked was that people were interviewed by first of all, there was a Russian translator in the room, which is problematic for some of the Ukrainians, but there was a Russian translator in the room who then translated what the person said into English as the Harvard interviewer took notes. And then after the interview was over, recorded into a tape recorder the notes. So we are almost never dealing with long passages of what the respondents had actually said. Everything is refracted through the interviewers. And in many cases, they just leave out things that people say, and we'll put that in their notes. And now this person went on to talk about as always, the famine of 32, 33, ... That is, we have no idea what this person said. So, I mean, I think as a project for students to study an interview project, it would really work well, because they could really tear this thing apart and all of the things that were problematic with this whole study. And for that reason, any kind of quantitative analysis of how many times is Stalin's name mentioned or whatever, the data is so eccentric that you can't put any weight on it. I'll read you something. I mean, there are 3 different distinct populations in a certain way here of refugees. I talked about the non-Ukrainians beyond Ukraine. I really emphasize that in this paper. There are also the non-Ukrainians within Ukraine, which merit a whole study unto themselves. And then, of course, there are the Ukrainians who talk about the Holodomor at every opportunity they can get. Merle Feinsod, who's a very famous Harvard political scientist who was sent in 1949 to do a kind of preliminary set of interviews with some of the people who were candidates to be interviewed. He wrote in his notes, and this is absolutely astonishing. I think it really conveys the spirit of the times. Quote, "Whenever I have spoken to simple people, the first thing they all want to talk about is just this: how Stalin purposefully created a famine. This idea has become so deeply embedded in the minds of the peasants in particular that I feel safe in saying that it has become part of the folk saga of Ukraine, with more legendary importance than any of the positive achievements of the communist regime in that region." It's really kind of reflective of an attitude towards the people that were being interviewed. And so in coming back to almost all of your questions, you know, how often does Stalin's name come up? How is the data collected? You know, the famine of 32, 33. I mean, it's possible to do that kind of a qualitative analysis, but I don't think it's possible to put any importance on it, because it's as reflective of what the interviewer wanted to write about as much as it is of what the refugee wanted to talk about. But thank you for your questions. The one I really value, I have to say, is going back and looking at the context in which these breakthroughs take place, where they're prompted to talk about the famine. That's a really important, interesting question for me.
Thank you. There's a question here from Tech to Charley in the chat. I have a question for Charley Boerman. Do you see common features between the use of the destroyed motherhood motif in visual representations of the Holodomor and the Irish famine?
Yes, thank you, Wiktoria, for that question. Yeah, a lot. I mean, in my analysis of these films, I mostly base myself on theory about the Irish famine, about literary depictions of the Irish famine. But because I do comparative work also on Finnish famine and Greek famine, I see the same representative repertoires there. So in stories, but also in monuments. And there's one Greek monument. From what I can tell, it's the only figurative monument or sculpture dedicated to the famine. It's in Athens, and it's a really very graphic sculpture of a dead mother. She's lying on her back and she's naked, and her bones are sticking out. It's very skeletal, and there's an infant on her breast, and the breast is very dried out, and the infant is still trying to get milk from the breast. And it's and I think in some Irish depictions you also see this very spectacular graphic skeletal, quite voyeuristic representations where the mother is almost completely naked, and there's this search for her breast. So I definitely I come at this trope from Irish sort of culture theory, but I see it in the other famines that I research. And we've already exchanged emails, so I can send you materials, or we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we have actually not even a minute left. There is one last question here from Dr. Serbin to Norman Naimark. The way you use the two terms, one after the other, that Holodomor and Ukrainian genocide, were two different notions. The Holodomor was the famine, and the genocide was included in the Holodomor. This is the basic problem that I see in Ukrainian scholarship: etymological use of the term Holodomor, Morete Holodomor. Could you clear this up for me?
Just wait a minute. Am I muted or not?
You're good.
Yes. Am I muted? No.
Oh, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. I just wrote to Roman, Professor Serbin, about this in the chat. And I wasn't 100% sure what he meant, and he explained what he meant, and I tried to explain to him what I meant. It's a complicated problem in the historiography, and I don't want to go into detail with this, but is the famine itself, in quotes, genocide, the Holodomor, or the many of the events associated with the Holodomor, which include things like the attack on the Ukrainian intelligentsia, the denial of movement by peasants, the denial that there was even a famine, the lack of relief, the inability to, the lack of willingness of the Soviet government to accept relief and that sort of thing. So I would just say, I think we've cleared this up in the chat. And, this issue, which he has been a real pioneer in trying to define, is to figure out exactly how one should speak about genocide and the Holodomor together. And, one of the ways that it's been dealt with is to call it, a genocide Holodomor, or Holodomor genocide. And, in some ways that strikes me as unnecessary anymore, that we understand Holodomor itself is genocide. Although strictly speaking, it's just the famine and just the starvation, but not really. It's a broader attack on the Ukrainian nation.
We'll be waiting for the book to come out. Okay, thank you everyone very much for your insightful talks, insightful discussion. That was all very interesting. Please have a restful evening and join us again tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. EST for our 9th panel, which is titled Collectivization in Holodomor, the Experience of Children and Youth. And there will be simultaneous translation into English for the presentations given in Ukrainian for that one. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Goodbye.